Wubba lubba dub dub!
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Esports Money, ZSM, Mac10, whatever you want to call me, and welcome to another video on the VR Force channel. I'm thinking I'm going to start saying something different for the VR Force opening, and I need a formal VR Force intro to differentiate from my typical stuff, but I think getting the video out there today is more important than just spending the day working on the intro. So, as the title suggests, and as my schedule suggests, today we're going to be talking about emulators. We're going to be talking about what an emulator is, what it does, what are some currently available emulators that work well. Excuse me if the audio jams up for just a second as I adjust my desk. And some emulators I've used personally, which is why the Wikipedia page is up. And yeah, so let's get into it. What is an emulator? So an emulator is a program, at least in terms of video games. An emulator is a program that emulates a console. So if we think of these as bits of software, an emulator is a console and a ROM is the game cartridge or disc that goes in the console that makes it work. Now there are a lot of additional components depending on which console you're trying to emulate, but essentially you can boil it down to those two parts. So some emulators, the older the system is, the more reliably you can emulate it as a general rule. This doesn't hold true in the sense of Nintendo stuff. I mean, it still kind of does, but they bend the rules just a bit. So for Nintendo consoles, you have emulators for pretty much everything. Almost every system that's ever been made by Nintendo, you can reliably emulate. The Nintendo Switch, I think, is a notable exception because it's so new, but there will be Switch emulators relatively quickly, I think. Nintendo is so well known for doing console exclusives that the emulation scene around Nintendo is really, really big. In fact, you can emulate the Nintendo Wii U more reliably than you can emulate the original Xbox. Not the Xbox 360 or One, but the very first Xbox ever made. You can reliably emulate the GameCube, and there are a lot of benefits to emulating, but we'll get into that in a moment. So the first thing, talking about systems that I have personally reliably used emulators for, and ones that I know that you can. So most of the Atari systems I have at least tinkered with. At one point I had a really solid Jaguar emulator and a MAME emulator for the Atari 7800. Actually, no, maybe this is the MES. Yes, no, I have had this. I have had that. Not as interesting, again, at least for me, because I started playing games around the Super Nintendo area, or the Super Nintendo era, and Wolfenstein 3D was one of the first video games that were played on PC. So things older than that are a little bit harder for me to get into, so I never spent too much time playing Atari games. That being said, because of the simplicity of those games, there's a huge amount of them, and those emulators run reliably. The NES has a plethora of emulators. All of these are emulators for the NES. Most of them will probably work. I believe I've used Nestopia, 3D NES. I think I've used... Ooh, you can do VR stuff with 3D NES. So we will actually be playing like this. We'll be playing with this a bit, because it has some VR compatibility, so that makes it interesting. The SNES is probably the system that I have the most experience emulating. I have never had a problem with the SNES 9X playing a video game. To my knowledge, you just plug and play, or by plug, you run the ROM file, and then you can just play the game. I've had the SNES, and I've had the SNES. But the SNES 9X is probably the king of Super Nintendo emulation. It is pretty solid. The Windows 8 phone actually has an unofficial port called the SNES 8X. The emulator Pocket SNES for Pocket PCs is based on the SNES 9X. The source code is publicly available, and it is almost certainly the best SNES emulator available. It's had an update as of 2016, and this has been in development, I think, since 2002 or 3. I don't think it says here, but as of 2005, Retrogrammer called it the best SNES emulator. and it's sweet. It's free, open source, free for good use, personal use. The N64, I have used Project 64. I've used it quite a bit. I have had issues with this one. I had issues running Banjo-Tooie, but Super Mario 64 runs like a dream, and I would actually prefer to run Super Mario 64 through Project 64 than a typical, than an N64, or through a Wii with an emulator in the Wii. And we'll get to why in a little bit. Dolphin is a GameCube and Wii emulator. Boots every GameCube game. I actually didn't know that. I don't know how reliably it does Wii games. I have not used Dolphin, but I'm pretty sure it's on my computer because the Dolphin is a very exciting emulator because of the fact that it runs GameCube games. And the reason being, we'll get into it. We'll get into this in a moment. But with older consoles that run 3D graphics, the emulator can often do a much better job with them than the console could at the time. In terms of handhelds, pretty much every handheld device has got an emulator. The 3DS may be missing one. Yeah, Citra, which is in development, so it's relatively new. Actually, I skipped over something relatively important. So the Wii U, Cemu. Cemu is probably the most impressive emulator ever made. That 1.8.1b, I don't think that's actually accurate. I think there is, actually no, that's June 30th, so that is accurate. There's a new version since the one I downloaded. I have played through around 40% of Zelda Breath of the Wild on Cemu, and the reason I stopped playing was because I sort of hit a wall in my gameplay, and I'm in a part that I find really annoying, and I'll just have to go back and deal with it sometime. But it wasn't due to the emulator, it was due to the game. Like, the emulator is essentially flawless. Like, it's as good as... It's actually better than the console. And Breath of the Wild came out this year, and there's an emulator out there that will run this thing at 30 FPS at 4K. And you're going, 30? Why not 60? Well, the Wii U is actually bound to 30 FPS, or at least Breath of the Wild on the Wii U is bound to 30 FPS, as is the Switch. And it will upscale that resolution way higher than the Switch will. It looks way better on my computer than it does on my roommate's Switch connected to his TV. Virtual Boy is very, very, very old. It's an old console. We can take a quick look at this. Basically it's designed to be like one of the first VR headsets, and it was like crap. It's crap. It's straight up crap. Like, why would you want that? I guess you could run these emulators through an Oculus if you really wanted to, like, play this old crap, but again, it's crap. Master System, Game Gear. Genesis, I have played Genesis emulators. They work fine. Not a big Dreamcast. I haven't actually toyed around with this, and the reason being that a lot of this stuff, if a game will run natively on Windows with a remake or will run through an emulator, usually it's a good idea to buy it on Steam or get a physical copy of the game rather than play it on an emulator, because you're going to get a better overall and less buggy experience, except with certain PlayStation games. Final Fantasy VII HD I haven't played just yet. The same is true for Final Fantasy X and 11. I haven't played the remastered versions of those, and I've also not tried toying with PlayStation 1 and 2 emulators. Speaking of PlayStation 1, EPSXE is great. You have to download a file called a BIOS file, which basically is it's basically legal DRM protection for the group that made the emulator, but you download that file from another source, put that into the emulator, and it works fine. And again, still being updated relatively recently, June 23rd, 2016. Today's July 20th of 2017, but considering the PlayStation 1 was from like 1995 or 1996, ancient console and has a relatively recent release. So the Neutrino SX2 is the PlayStation 2 emulator. Is a PlayStation 2 emulator. Last release was 2004. PlayStation 2 Classics. Oh, this is an emulator that's built into the PS3 for PS2. PCSX2, January 8th, 2016 had an update. Play is a PS2 emulator for mobiles. I don't know a lot about PlayStation 2 emulation, which is interesting because PlayStation 2 has maybe the largest number of video games ever released for console since the early like Atari systems. But PlayStation 2 emulation is on the fritz, to the best of my knowledge. I would say PCSX2 is probably pretty solid. I think I had this years and years and years ago when it originally launched. Yeah, 2002. So I had a copy of this emulator back in 2002, and it's compatible with 95.18% of 2,592 tested games. So it is pretty reliable. So you can reliably emulate PS2, which is not a surprise. PS4 is the Nucleus emulator for PlayStation 4. I don't know that much about. I've actually, this is my first time seeing it, so I'm assuming it's just an early project, because PlayStation 4 is a relatively new console. But because because console hardware is starting to look like PC hardware more and more with every new generation, I'm assuming that this will be a pretty quick process. PS3 is a console that a lot of people have actually put a good deal of effort into emulating, because of the fact that there are a few big name PS3 exclusives that a lot of people would like to play, and people like me, like Demon Souls is a big one for me. I've never played Demon Souls, and I've beaten the first Dark Souls twice. I'm almost at the end of Dark Souls 3, and I'm like, I don't know, 60%, 70% through Dark Souls 2. So I'm a big Dark Souls, I enjoy Dark Souls a lot, and I would love to play the game that started the series, but it's a PS3 exclusive. So sort of like the emulators for the Wii U focus on showcasing Breath of the Wild, this emulator, and I would assume the most PS3 emulators, focus on showcasing Dark or Demon Souls. PSP, don't know too much about, but I'd assume they're relatively reliable, especially since there's one that was this emulator, which was updated this year. So I'm assuming it's pretty reliable. Xbox, this looks like we have a 2016 updated for Xbox. Xbox 360, Xenia is an emulator that I heard about quite a while ago. I think it was first like released, I want to say like 10 years ago. Xenia is a free and open source emulator. It can only play 50 360 titles at full speed. In March 2014, they showcased it playing Frogger 2. So again, the speed at which Xbox 360 emulation is moving is abysmally bad. It's very slow. NEC, what is NEC? I probably am going to slap myself in the gaming. NEC. What is this? NEC console. Oh, it's one of these. Ooh, yeah, nobody cares about those. Sorry if you care about those. Maybe you care about those because in an emulator you have the potential to play for free. So now that we've been over sort of a brief list of emulators that I've tried and can personally vouch for and just the general history of this, let's talk a little bit about the pros and the cons. So like the cons I'll talk about first, and the pros are kind of inherent, but we'll get into them. So one of the big cons with emulation is it's a lot of the times illegal. If you own the console and you own the game, I believe it is technically legal. I know it is legal with most systems, but I think it is legal with all systems for you to download an emulator and a ROM. So I own a Super Nintendo and Super Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars, and I will download the ROM and the game the emulator, and that's legal for me to have copies of that software because I have the physical hardware and software that corresponds with it. I paid for it once. In terms of whether or not you get caught, like it's like pirating music. It's essentially the same thing as pirating games, but when you're talking about N64 ROMs, you're talking like 20 megs that are stored on websites that are not in giant files, so you can just grab them and then play N64 games. It's a pretty quick process, and I think the distributors are people that need to be more concerned than the people downloading. Breath of the Wild is like with the newer emulators, I'm worried that there's some like fine print there's some piece of software that you're not supposed to have, even if you own the console and the game. That being said, the CMU people are pretty straightforward. There's also a program, I'm trying to think of what this thing is called. Let me check my other monitor. It is called, oh yeah, Wii U USB Helper. And what this will do is it will download Wii U ROMs from a massive database of them, and you can actually load them onto a USB stick to put into your console if you crack your console, or you can have it automatically booted up with whatever version of CMU you have installed, and then play from there. I have personally tested that with Breath of the Wild. So as far as cons go, it's pretty much just that, and then bugginess, frame rates. With Breath of the Wild, I noticed that I'm using like 19 or 20 gigabytes of RAM when the game runs. I have 32 gigs of RAM, and it's using 20, so that's a lot. Trying to think of what else. That's pretty much it as far as bad stuff. In terms of pros, the benefits are portability and flexibility. So like some of these emulators will let you use VR stuff with them, and that's really, really cool. Like I would love to go and then maybe play Super Mario 64 in VR. I don't know, I mean, I'm sure it will be a weird experience, but it would be fun at least. It'd be a cool novelty. Another reason is you can use any controller you like. So I have this, it's not officially made by Microsoft, but it's an Xbox 360 controller. It's designed to emulate an Xbox controller. I forget who makes it. It was like $35, and I actually enjoy the way it feels more than a regular 360 controller, and I enjoy the way it feels more than pretty much all the controllers for all the consoles I run emulation for. So that's an obvious bonus. Another benefit are save states. A lot of consoles don't use them. A lot of the newer ones don't, but almost all of the old consoles do. And what a save state does is it saves the exact moment in the game that you're in. So if you load up that game in your emulator and then load the save state, it will take you to exactly where you were. It's basically giving you a save game function for anywhere and any time. In some games like Demon's Souls, for example, if you have save states in that game, it is kind of cheating, but it's also a way to make sure that you've actually saved your game in case because some emulators don't actually keep up the progress in the game. You have to make a save state and then load that save state to get back into it. It doesn't just treat it like it doesn't remember like a normal console might when you turn it off. At least with the early ones. With the Wii U, with CMU, I don't use save states, and I've been able to just load my game every time. The biggest benefit to using emulators, in my opinion, is you can really breathe new life. There's a bug in my room. You can really breathe new life into old games. And what I mean by this is you can like add anti-aliasing and antroscopic filtering and up the resolution. I'm playing Super Mario 64 at 60 frames per second with incredibly high anti-aliasing settings on, incredibly high antroscopic filtering settings on. The game looks 1,000 times better than it does on a CRT with an N64. It just looks awesome. It looks awesome. And it feels better too. And I can either adjust it to widescreen or I can play it in the native 4:3. And a lot of emulators, especially N64 emulators, because they've been around for so long, actually know how to zoom out enough to let you play in widescreen without smearing the image or stretching the image across. So that's really the big benefit. So that's pretty much it for today's show, guys. I plan on in future talking more about specific emulators, going over emulation installs, going over emulation demos. If you want to watch me stream, and part of a big chunk of my stream is usually emulation and playing Banjo-Kazooie, Mario 64, older games, things like that, you can find it over on youtube.com/MACKCOWANII. That is my main YouTube channel. If you like this video, please hit that like button and the subscribe buttons. I think I've got like 6 or 7 subscribers on this channel right now. It is a brand new channel, and if you are here for VR, like I assume most people will be here for, go check out the video before this, which is a guide to or it's a giveaway for a game called Carnage Chronicles on Steam, which is potentially my favorite VR game at the time. So thank you guys so much for watching, and peace out.